Hey everyone, Nick Engvall here. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about some of the people that make the sneaker history community and this podcast possible. It's more important than ever to think about who you give your money to when you're buying clothing to go with your kicks. Our friends at Guilty Goods started their brand with a goal of giving back, especially to the communities that make sneaker culture possible. With every purchase from Guilty Goods, at least 10% of the proceeds are donated to organizations like Big Brothers and Big Sisters, the Susan G. Komen Foundation, the Movement for Black Lives, and many more. You can save 30% on your order by using the code HISTORY at guiltygoods.us. Again, that's history at guiltygoods.us for 30% off, and you can feel good about your purchase knowing you're supporting a meaningful cause. Sneakers are all about presentation, and if you're like me, displaying your kicks at home or in the office is just as important as when they're on your feet. Sneaker Throne makes sneaker display cases featuring customizable LED lights, drop-side cases to showcase the entire side of the shoe, not just the heel or the toe, the whole shoe. They've also got display cases for trading card collectors and hat collectors. To me, it's the perfect way to display your collection. You can save at least 10% on your Sneaker Throne order by using the code HISTORY at sneakerthrone.com. That's history at sneakerthrone.com. If you're a Patreon supporter or a member of our Discord community, you already know about Kicks with V Hot Sauce and his small batch, locally sourced hot sauce. V has been one of the biggest supporters of sneaker history and the podcast since the early days. He's currently the defending champion in our community trivia nights competition. Kicks with V Hot Sauce has been a huge hit with the community. You can save 10% on your order by using the code SneakerHistory10 at kickswithvhots.com. That's SneakerHistory10 at kickswithvhots.com. Now, you're probably here because you like sneakers, and if you join the Discord, you know our community is about so much more than that. Whether it's the marathon-like community calls, trivia night debates, the in-person meetups, or just sharing our favorite experiences, we found that although we have such different backgrounds, we all have some unexpected shared passions. Not only does the entire community look out for each other when it comes to releases, we're like a support group for life in general. You can join the Discord community for free by heading to the show notes of this episode. After you're done listening to this episode, tell someone you like their kicks today. You never know how far a simple compliment can take you, and we all know how good it feels to have someone show their appreciation. Now let's get into today's episode.
Jordan trying to shake off Starks. Oh, what a move!
James with no regard for human life. Final seconds. Bryant for the win.
Iverson against Gill. The crowd on its feet. Allen for the win.
Welcome to the Sneaker History Podcast.
What up, what up? Welcome to the Sneaker History Podcast. My name is Nick Engvall, and today I'm excited. I'm excited for today. Today we have something a little bit different for you. As you might know, we have an amazing community of sneaker enthusiasts that hang out in our Sneaker History Discord on a daily basis. While sneakers are the connection point that brought us all together, we've all discovered countless shared passions that we share with other people in the community. This week, we launched the first of a handful of new podcasts that will be coming directly from our community. We'll get into the details for those podcasts in a future episode, but I am super excited to share the Exhaust Notes podcast with everyone today. It's a show about racing cars, automotive-related topics, and honestly, just another passion that I'm super excited about. If you're a fan of Formula One or Formula Drift, or maybe you hit up Cars and Coffee, or maybe you're just a weirdo like me that enjoys the smell of gasoline, I think you'll enjoy this one. If you do, add Exhaust Notes to your subscribe list so you'll be updated when we drop future episodes. As always, thank you for supporting Sneaker History, and don't forget to tell someone you like their kicks today. Please enjoy the first episode of our new podcast, Exhaust Notes. Welcome to the Exhaust Notes podcast. My name is Nick Engvall, and I am one of your hosts for today's episode. If you're a fan of cars, racing cars, just curious about all things automotive, or maybe you're one of those weirdos like me that likes the smell of gasoline, you're in the right place. Let's get into today's show. Welcome to the Exhaust Notes podcast.
Lights out, everybody. It's the Exhaust Notes podcast. I've got my head driver, Nick Engvall. I've got my chief mechanic, Todd Yates, and I'm the plucky young upstart, Rote Malhotra. This is an extension of the Sneaker History podcast, and it's just more, if anything, a midlife crisis, if we're being honest with ourselves. I kid, but really what I've got today is two of the most knowledgeable race fans that I know, Nick and Todd. How are you gentlemen today? How's everything in your world, Todd?
Very good, very good. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And I believe this is a debut for you, so we're looking to see some sort of pole performance from you because you are our dirty little secret when it comes to this new podcast, so thank you for joining. And then, as always, the Senna, the Prost, the Hamilton, the Schumacher even. Nick Engvall, what's going on?
What's up, man? That's so much pressure. I don't even know if I can handle. That's like such a crazy, yeah. But yeah, I'm
It's a crazy intro, but we're going to get you there because that's what I have to do as your wingman, if you will, or your secondary driver. I'm basically going to tie up the midfield so then you have a clear path to that checkered flag. But we really wanted to kind of start this podcast because there's enough of a notable presence, not only in the Sneaker History Discord, cheap plug, but just pop culture right now about Formula One. So we figured, why not take two established presidents, one person that's really enthusiastic about it but doesn't understand the technical nuance, and just get a good starter conversation going. Because at the end of the day, we've all been there where we want to check out this cool new thing, but we don't know where to go. So we're hoping we can be that for Formula One for all 15 of you that are still listening after that long, rambly intro. But Nick, you want to start us off somewhere?
Yeah, man. So basically, I was trying to think back to when I first got introduced to Formula One. And I don't know the exact era, but, probably early to mid 90s. I don't know who, but somebody bought me a Hugo Boss. I think it was probably my dad or my grandparents, but like a Hugo Boss remote controlled, Formula One car. A terrible, it was one of those like true classic remote control cars where you went forward and you reversed in a circle, so like that was the only real turning you did. But that was kind of what got me interested in it. And, I was already kind of interested in cars, but with Formula One, it just became like something that I loosely paid attention to throughout the Senna era. And, kind of got a little bit heavier into it in the late 90s, early 2000s with like Barr, Honda, and those types of teams, the Benson Hedges teams that were Mugen powered from my Honda days. But I guess it's still my Honda days now because I haven't given up on all the Honda stuff. But that's kind of my stepping into Formula One as a fan. The last few years obviously have been, exponential. So my girlfriend Cam has, kind of invested her time into watching the Netflix, Drive to Survive series with me and has her favorites. And it's the first time that Formula One kind of became something that other people were interested in that weren't necessarily like, the cars and coffee friends of mine that I would be seeing on the weekends necessarily, but just your average everyday people, because it's being introduced to America kind of in a new, with social media, Netflix, all of the above kind of way. So I just thought it would be cool to talk about this kind of stuff with you guys and kind of give people some insight as to like how, what Formula One is, a grandiose overview, but like also what, different walks of life find interesting about it. And you guys obviously being kind of the first two people that came to mind just because we've been doing this fantasy league and having some fun with that too. So another way for us to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of the races and stuff.
Excellent. So Todd, how about you? Like what drove you, sorry, the first of many bad racing puns. What drove you to the sport and why do you maintain with it? Because I know we so often get caught up in this new flashy thing. And then after a while, they're like, let me just go back to the comfort food that is American sports. But what about Formula One made it so enticing?
Yeah. So kind of similar to Nick's answer. I grew up loving cars, everything automotive. My dad was, my dad was into cars. And, but it's weirdly enough, my mom, who in a roundabout way got me into Formula One. So I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and some pretty famous racing family, the Unser family, is from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I remember vividly being at a restaurant during the Indy 500. I think it was 92 or 94. I know that he won both of those years, Al Unser Jr., but she wouldn't leave this restaurant. We'd already eaten our meal and everything and been there a while, and she would not leave the restaurant until the race was over. So we stayed well past our welcome. But fast forward a few years kind of into high school for me, I kind of stumbled upon Formula One. Well, I watched my first races. I think it was on like Wide World of Sports that same year. I think it was 94. And that was unfortunately the year that Senna died and Schumacher joined. And so that piqued my interest, but I didn't start watching more steadily until kind of the late 90s, Hakkinen, Villeneuve, those kind of drivers. And then Kind of stepped away from it my late teens, 20s. And then probably when Danny Rick joined the pod, he just is a character that I connected with. He was just weird and goofy and fun loving. And that's when I really started to nerd out, and just have been kind of following him as a driver ever since. And I think we're blessed now, as Kardashian like as it is, to have the Drive to Survive series, because even like Nick mentioned, like I loosely got my wife interested into, she'll listen to me at least talk about the races now. So yeah, that's good. That's me.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I mean, I think to continue my origin story as well, the same thing as you guys, I had prominent family members that were essential in my development growing up. So when I was raised in India, my uncle, and probably the family member closest to me in age, decided that his nephew should be able to say the ABCs. And in this sense, the ABCs meant having cars or models for every letter. So I grew up with A is for Aston Martin, B is for Bentley. And as I kind of grew older, I was like, man, cars aren't great other than the fact that I can take a Hot Wheels and just kind of spin it. And that was basically a fidget spinner for your boy when he was 3. But one thing that was constant was my uncle's love of Michael Schumacher, or Schumi, who kind of is now getting a proper reintroduction, because I think Netflix is probably as big of a catalyst to now getting me into it as well, because like you both had mentioned, Formula One, Drive to Survive, and now we've got the Schumacher documentary, which looks intense and incredible and all those great things. But to me, it was the familiarity of something that I once thought foreign. So as we're watching the Drive to Survive, and you have that likable protagonist in Danny Rick, and he is the perfect entry point to get to know some of the other drivers that you're like, okay, Max Verstappen, really good, quasi-Nazi looking, but hey, I'm here for it because he seems to be really good. Hopefully he's not anti-Semitic, and this is where I'm going to get kicked off the show, but anyway, I digress. But then also getting to know the Lewis Hamiltons of the world, and then getting to know the fringe characters. So for me, I just was drawn to Esteban Ocon, who's essentially a midfield driver, but something about his origin story where one of the prior misconceptions that I had about the sport was everybody was from the rich elite of Europe. And this was one person like Lewis who kind of had to bring himself up from the bootstraps and kind of rely on his family selling everything, including their own home, just to fund this kid's racing hobby / passion and now profession. So that's what got to me was, once again, because this is sports and we're living in that era where narrative drives everything, I was able to see patterns that I see in American fandom that I have. And I'm like, oh, this player reminds me of this team in American sports. I have this feeling towards him. And when you put it on that fundamental level, to me, I think that's what the secret sauce is. And I think that's why we're seeing all these people gravitate to it. It was kind of sad because I got caught up last 2 seasons, and then I was ready for the 2020 season. And unfortunately, COVID hit. And that, to me, is probably one of the most interesting things, because I thought that was going to be a death knell, because for all the goodwill and the publicity that Drive to Survive was giving Formula One, I was like, they're not going to last because this happened. But lo and behold, if anything, it's caused people to double down. So I'm one of those new people that just fell in love with the sport because there's a reality TV show component to it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how it has survived and progressed past COVID, right? I mean, obviously COVID's still, wreaking havoc on the world, but as far as Formula One having to shut down races, everywhere essentially, and stick to one track for a continued, amount of time, that takes away from a lot of the interesting elements of what it is, right? If it's the same track all the time, it's not as challenging for the drivers. It's not as competitive most of the time. And I think, part of what drew me into Formula One originally was, getting to see all these other places, right? Like I've had a Monaco poster in my house for 20 something years, like a giant, I forget the artist name, but that whole elusiveness of what that race was, right, just was like, wow, there's just so many places that I want to go see in my lifetime. And yet, I don't know, 10, 15 times a year, these are places where there's Formula One races. So it just seemed like this would be like the perfect thing for me to be interested in as somebody who wanted to travel more and see, what else is out there besides what we're kind of, fed in America, unfortunately. But I think too, like the other part of the getting through COVID, it was really, it felt really, it felt like a moment of unity for the sport of Formula One to get through it, as opposed to some of the other sports where you had, just, so much back and forth and so much politicizing of everything and every moment. It really felt like, hey, we want to race and we're going to make this happen for the fans. And I just respected that so much, even though it wasn't, to the level that Formula One is on a regular basis. It was impressive to see the organization and the people and the community around it, kind of step up and say, no, this is going to continue on with the energy that we had built in the last 3-4 years, through, the Drive to Survive stuff. So I think that's the one thing that's always been missing from Formula One is the American aspect of it. Like America's never really embraced Formula One as a pinnacle piece of motorsport, in my opinion. It's always been a pinnacle piece of motorsport for the people that are interested in motorsports. But generally speaking, everyone in America is going to see the Indy 500, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but like the Indy 500, is incredible, right? Like everyone that is into cars and into racing, that's a moment that I think everybody kind of stops and pauses for, the same way that football fans, would for the Super Bowl and baseball fans would for the World Series. But Formula One itself there was never enough of it here, right? It was always like just out of reach, just kind of never made an impact through social circles, through, even social media, right? Like social media for Formula One took way longer to kind of get on board compared to sports like basketball, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I always kind of come back to this one. Why I think basketball and soccer do really well is these are the only two sports there isn't any sort of facial covering. So we can truly see the theater aspect of the sport as well as the sport itself. Formula One is probably as tricky of anything in terms of you can't even read the body language because you've got a car shielding it. So you really have to look at the fact that how they drive is essentially a personification of who they are. And I know that was one thing for me kind of getting into the sport. Whenever I would go frequent message boards or listen to different podcasts, my number one question was, I was almost approaching this from a video game stage of like, okay, if I see Fernando Alonso's driver profile in a PlayStation 4 game, like there are 5 categories: speed, aggression, tenacity, or technical prowess. Where are they in a scale from 1 to 5? So then I can at least understand, okay, this is a very aggressive driver, but he has no race pace. Or this person is super fast, but he's also super crashy. So Todd, walk me through how you were able to kind of understand the different nuances between different drivers, because to the untrained eye, it just looks like 20 dudes driving a track really fast, and I can't figure out what's going on.
That's a really good question. It's taken me probably the last 20 years to really be able to spot the things that the announcers are talking about, how the car turns in, the setup that they're going with that weekend. And it's funny that you mentioned video games. I have been sim racing for a long time, which is, I play the Formula One game among others, but when I feel like that's also a really good entry point for people casually. Like we all remember when like Gran Turismo came out and games like that, or other earlier racing games, like even going back to like F-Zero, like if you could understand what they're doing from a technical perspective, like driving a sim game, I've tried to introduce my family to it, and they're just like, oh, this is easy, it's video games, and then they drive immediately into a wall. We even myself and you guys as knowledgeable fans of F1 don't really understand how hard it is. So it really does take some studying, but I think, like we've been saying, the really good entry point is kind of the dramatized personalities that we get with Formula One, and the wealth of coverage that we have beyond even the Netflix thing. There's so much content on YouTube and YouTube personalities that are centered around Formula One that really are great entry points.
I was going to say this. What another thing that's been really helpful, and as we're kind of going through this episode, I think we'll all share kind of different entry points. There's a web series on YouTube called, I think, Grill the Grid, where every so often, I think once a month, they will ask all 20 drivers on the grid a certain question. And to Todd's point, it really, tell me how you are as a person without telling me how you are as a person. And the example I will use is there was a question where each driver had to go backwards in time and list the current driver. And so you start seeing people that are students of the game and then people that are just there because maybe their dad is a very ominous figure that can write a really big check. And it was one of those things where I've kind of let my allegiances be known. I really like Ocon for whatever reason. But watching that and watching Sebastian Vettel just brush off winner after winner after winner until the actual first start year was impressive. And I'm like, you know what? I am going to be a fan of this guy. And because to me, he almost seems like the Tim Duncan of Formula One, where he's just this kind of boring dude who goes to the race, not on a fancy, flashy car, but his bicycle. And he's staying afterwards to pick up the trash from all the fans that are there. And it's that type of connection that, once again, I'm like, okay, this is helping me color in the lines a little, because it will take me the aforementioned 20 years to really understand the tactical nuance of an undercut versus an overcut, or what's happening if a pit stop has gone right, or more importantly, what's happening if it's gone wrong. But we'll use this as an entry point, Nick. So walk us through how Formula One is set up today. And if you think there's anything else from previous eras that might help define the sport for a new listener like myself, go for it. But
yeah, so you have essentially, 10 teams with 2 drivers per team. Those teams could be, you can have a Red Bull, which is, kind of a top tier team up there with the Mercedes team. Then you have kind of their secondary team, which now is called AlphaTauri, which is still, very much like funded by Red Bull and, a part of that world. They, this season, as we're recording this, they're using Honda engines. The relationships exist for both teams. Then you also have a situation where, the Mercedes team, which, this year is Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, which Mercedes provides engines for the McLaren team. So like you have, kind of these layers to how everyone's connected through the sport, and then you have kind of Ferrari, who is, somehow still comes across as like, we are the best, regardless of whether we win or not, kind of not in an arrogant way through their people on the track, or even in the pits. Right. But just the like overall, like energy of, Enzo Ferrari kind of just seeps through the team still to this day. And even as just like not a Ferrari fan, I still am like, wow, it's Ferrari. Like there's still an element of like, this is like some sort of deity on the racetrack, right? And I think, I don't remember statistically, but like I'm pretty sure Ferrari has won, exponentially more than most teams throughout the years. Formula One's been around since, I want to say 1950, 1960,
56, I think.
Yeah, so something like that. So, and if there were other ways to get you interested in racing as a general subject, I think there's plenty of films out there that we can get into probably on a future episode, but just Ford versus Ferrari will give you a good idea of the kind of aura of what Ferrari is out there in the world. And it's not good or bad, in my opinion. It is what it is kind of in Formula One. But I also think that, you have kind of teams like Alfa Romeo. We have an American team right now, Haas, which is, both those teams are kind of struggling to keep up the pace with the rest of Formula One. But it's kind of important for people that are new to Formula One to understand, like, when we say that a car is not keeping pace, that's in races only, right? Like that is like when it comes to qualifying, these cars are within a second or two up and down the grid, 20 cars. Sometimes even tenths of a second, hundredths of a second, thousandths of a second separates literally the top 10 cars, right? So I think that the sport itself it provides a lot of interesting ways for you to become a fan. And I was thinking about this before we started recording throughout today. It's almost like you could become a fan of the individual drivers. That's now an opportunity. You get to see them on social media. If you want just fun, like to Todd's point, Daniel Ricciardo is incredibly entertaining as a human being. If you want to see just like two happy kids, like it's almost like, like teenage boys playing, in the court down the street from their house. Look at like the AlphaTauri team with Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda. These guys are like genuinely seem like they're brothers from another mother, hanging out all the time after races and, in between and travel and all this stuff. And it just seems like they are like, I guess the best way to interpret that, they seem like what I wanted to do as like the aspiring skateboarder, let's just get in a van and drive around the world skateboarding. They're basically doing that in like a grandiose scale with Formula One.
In private jets.
Yeah, private jets, yeah. But I do think that like the other interesting aspects of people getting interested, there's like the individuals, there's obviously the teams. Some teams are, a massive automotive brand like Mercedes or Renault or Alfa Romeo or any of these teams that have, a big, massive brand that you're already familiar with as a consumer, right? For the most part, or at least the name, right? Then there's kind of like the team level, right? Because they're competing on, as teams. So even though everybody's out there for themselves, you're also competing for your team because there's manufacturer championship, which, when you have guys that are really competitive, that throws another wrench into how they approach the race, how their teams approach the race, how their race is managed by, the pit crews and the team principals and all that stuff. So, and then I also think that there's just like there's the kind of, like where, like the origins of all these guys, right? Like you might only root for a British racer because your family's from London or something like that. Or, you might find somebody that's, from your hometown, and next thing you know, you're a fan of that team for years to come. And I think that's kind of works across racing as a whole. But Formula One is really, gives you all of those aspects. And I think the final way that you can kind of look at it is like, like these are just beautiful, incredibly well-engineered machines that are as much art as they are some performance vehicle, right? So like, I definitely have friends that have just look at a car and like, that's the team that I love this year because that car is so good. And I think that's a good way to go too, because, like some of these paint schemes, liveries in the racing world are absolutely phenomenal. Like they just resonate with people. And I think you see that as the seasons go by, where there's slight changes and change, maybe the drivers change the helmet to, tell another story. And those layers kind of just give you, like I could say that, Lando Norris is my favorite driver right now, but I also will root for 10 other people on the grid because of all these various things. And I think that is what makes it so exciting for me to see more people getting into it, because there's other stories that I might not be able to see or consume or, catch on YouTube or know because somebody else has that connection to it. And then it gets more personal for you, the more friends you have that are into sport.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was going to use that opportunity to have Todd kind of explain the format of the races, because Nick, you did a tremendous job talking to us about the drivers and the machinery. But Todd, could you walk us through what we would want to get ourselves into if we decide, hey, next week there's a race, and I think there's some events Friday and there might be some on Saturday? Walk me through that, because I think that's probably another good way for people to realize how much of a commitment can I give this new sport.
Oh, yeah. You can get real nerdy, which I'm about to do. So generally, what Wednesdays, teams show up on Tuesdays. Set up. It's like 1,000 moving pieces. Like Nick mentioned, some of these teams are conglomerates like Mercedes, and they have 300 people traveling. So the fact that they can get them to 20 places around the world within a week of each other sometimes is just staggering. But teams will show up on Tuesdays generally. We'll have, track walk and preparations on Wednesday, which if you follow, any social medias, you can see bits and pieces of that, of the teams. Then Thursdays is usually media day. So they'll have interviews, they'll have press conferences, again, more content in all the social media spaces. And then Friday will be usually, and I'm talking a typical weekend. They've started to change it up a little bit this year, but usually Friday they'll have 2 practice sessions that consist of an hour now. They used to be an hour and a half, and there was kind of a lot of dead air that the commentators would have to fill. So it's a little bit more action-packed and exciting this year. So it's 2 one-hour sessions of them going through, race pace simulation, qualifying simulation, different tire compounds that they use within the races. They'll test all of that stuff out. Then on Saturday, they'll have practice 3 in the morning, and then Saturday afternoon, they'll have qualifying, which consists of 3 rounds. It's all 20 cars on track. The top 15 advance to the next round. That's Q2. And then on to Q3 with the last 10 cars. That's the final shootout for the pole position or fastest lap of that day. And then they line up in order of time. Again, Nick mentioned earlier that it's in qualifying form. The top 7 can be within 0.3 of a second of each other, which is like faster than an eye blink usually. And then on Sunday, we'll have the Grand Prix, which is, thanks to us being in the U.S., usually about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. So if you're trying to get into Formula One, you can become an early bird or just watch it later, like most people do. I'm a psychopath, and I got up at 4:30 this morning to watch the race. So, and then on to the next one, times 23.
Right. And I think that is probably as brilliant of a summary as I've heard about it, because, one other reason why the West Coast is the best coast is clearly we will all want to be that early bird that gets the worm, and in this case, the worm is hot machinery running all over the world. One other thing that I was kind of unfamiliar with until I started watching the races as well as the show is the concept of the primary and the secondary driver. So both Nick and Todd had mentioned that we have 10 teams. Each team has 2 drivers. Now, for the most part, each team has a number 1 driver and a number 2 driver. And the thought is your number 1 driver is your shining star, and your number 2 is some sort of combination of a role player / sacrificial lamb. But then you get into the nuances of the personalities, and you realize that while you may be competing with everybody on the grid, your number 1 competitor is your teammate, because they're the only one that, in theory, has the same equal machinery as you. So that's when you start seeing, okay, who truly is the cock of the walk for a team and who's just there because, hey, we needed an extra body to fill. Because as we were kind of alluding to, there are some teams, especially on the lower end of the grid, that it feels that they are just there as exercises and cannon fodder or moving racing cones. But that's another thing for another day. I would just kind of ask you guys to walk me through what your perceptions are of that number 1 versus number 2 thing, because if you don't know any better, it gets jarring. So what was something that is about the sport that you guys were caught unaware of until you started watching the sport? And I'll start off with you, Todd, because I think I've started with Nick the last couple of topics.
Sure, put me on the spot while I'm trying to think of something. I think with the exception of probably the last 7 or so years, I didn't realize how technical it was. And, you just mentioned that there's a number 1 and a number 2 driver, but you can see that the splits on between teammates, it can be massive, but they're trying to extract with science, essentially, magic, witchcraft, whatever it is, that extra 10th. And, the budgets that they put into this thing, where they'll put, $1 million into just brake duct R&D to get that extra tenth against their competitors. I didn't realize that when I was growing up watching it. It was just like they all kind of look the same, with the exception of the paint scheme for the most part. And the driver really makes a difference. But no, it's really truly a team sport. Even though there's only 2 people per team out there on the track competing, there's hundreds and hundreds of people back at the factories and in the pits that really can make the difference.
Excellent. Nick, how about you?
I think that's a good point, because you really think of it as an individual sport because it's one driver and one car, right? But, a pit stop, which, is 10 to 12 people, not to mention the engineers deciding when and where these happen during the races, can literally be the difference between a winning team and a losing team on a regular basis. It's very much you're out there by yourself, but you are dependent on all of those people to be competing and performing at the level of, the top 20 best drivers in the world, if you're really being honest about it, right? Like, these guys are incredibly talented. And, I think even just thinking about the G-forces that they're feeling, the physical exertion that they have to, put out in order to get through a race is just absolutely mind-boggling. For, as you dive into becoming a fan, you start to learn these nuances and these things that just don't appear without really becoming a fan and kind of learning about it. I think in terms of the drivers, the teams, the A and B of a team, right? The top driver and the secondary driver, a lot of the teams would, shy away from even acknowledging that in years past. And I think in more recent years, you're seeing like a more clear cut, hey, this is our number one guy. And, unfortunately, whoever's second, hopefully you push him to be better, and maybe someday you'll be better than him on the track. But generally speaking, it's like pretty clear cut with most of the teams over the past few years. But I think that, the interesting thing about that is you get into the personalities of these athletes, and that can throw a wrench into anything you thought existed in terms of hierarchy within the team. Right. As I said, being like one of the top 20 drivers in the world, you're talking about also potentially the biggest 20 egos in the world. Right. So, we have kind of all of these different storylines that play out under, in the garages, right, throughout the week, prepping, throughout the interviews, there's strategy even down to, what's said, because all of the teams can hear the radios from the other teams. So, there's a lot of strategy that goes into that. There's a lot of, making everybody guess what you're actually meaning when you say something. So I think the personalities really just start to pull you in so many ways that you just could never imagine. And, Netflix does that, but, now you can see it everywhere, right? Like I said about the AlphaTauri guys, right? Those guys, I mean, social media has been just brilliant with them, right? Like, it's like, you are not my favorite team, but I want to buy a hoodie because you guys are such cornballs and having so much fun out there. Like, that's like, so, to me, that's like what's come of all of this stuff, and what I really enjoy about those dynamics. And to even think about, like, yeah, we're the 2 best friends anyone could ever have. And then we get in the car and we'll run each other off the road and potentially put each other in crazy danger,
And if we're in Monaco, there's going to be boats and hose, because there is very much a Step Brothers vibe to the bromance between Pierre Gasly and one Yuki Tsunoda. Yep. And I think to the point that Todd also made, when you look at the staff, and the thing that gravitates in my mind in terms of making a comparison in the American sports sense is, I hate this term when I watch football, but that concept of skill players, right? Your receivers, your quarterbacks, your running backs, and then the offensive line, the unsung heroes of the team, are the nameless, faceless mob that just push forward and try to contain pressure. And that's what that support staff is for a lot of us, because a pit stop isn't important until it's important and you lose the race. So I definitely get that component of it. One thing I'll use this opportunity as well is to kind of outline, how do you win in Formula One? So there was allusions to it made by both of my brilliant co-hosts, but there are essentially two titles for every one Formula One season. There's the drivers and then there's the constructors. And we can use a made-up race in this case. But let's say we have a top three of Lewis, Max, and Danny Rick. Lewis wins 25 points. I believe Max in this hypothetical wins 20, and Danny Rick wins 15. And please correct me if I'm wrong on those point totals, guys.
18, I think.
18?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, it doesn't matter.
You get some sort of points if you're in the top 10. And those points count towards the two races that I'd mentioned. You have the driver's race, where we literally see, okay, who's the driver that's accumulated the most points? Because in theory, they're the ones that have had the most top 10 finishes or the most podium finishes in the top three. And then similarly, you're working together in terms of your teammate and trying to make sure you win the constructor's title. And that is that race team that has those two drivers that's accumulated the most points, same criteria. So that's something that's really been interesting to watch, because I believe the last 7 years, we've seen Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes win, with the exception of 1 year, because I think that was the Rosenberg year, correct?
Rosberg.
And so that's another thing for whenever we kind of,
that was it.
Go for it,
yeah.
Please.
2014 or 2016.
Nico Rosberg. Yep. 2014. See, this is why. See, I'm all ambition and pluck, and Todd is efficiency and cold calculations, and I love it. So what we're talking about now is the fact that you have these two competitions, and what was interesting to me was when I go through the history of the sport, it's very similar to, let's say, any dynasty in any sport, where Formula One seems to have a huge block in terms of one team will win, let's say, 6 out of 7 years. And then something happens, whether it's a rule shift, and we'll see a new car, and then we'll see a new winner that seems to dominate that era. So, Nick, walk us through what these rule shifts are, because I believe we've got one coming up in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, the car itself will change drastically in 2022, right? You'll have, I guess, bigger wheels. So, like, this year's cars, and primarily for the past, couple of decades, the wheels are really tiny. The tires are massive and sticky as hell, which I think is the change to a bigger wheel and a slimmer tire, a shorter tire, in height, it's obviously motivated to, be more like industry standards for cars that we actually drive on the streets. A lot of racing that I've been into, Le Mans racing, American Le Mans back in the day, was very much like tried to kind of push the green energy hybrid, drivetrain. All of the things that were there were roughly translated from street cars in some way, shape, or form, or vice versa, right? It all kind of funnels back down into street cars. With Formula One, the obvious thing that never did was the wheels. It was like they were like this kind of one-off, 12-inch or whatever. Yeah, 12-inch?
13.
12-inch wheel,
13-inch wheel,
I think, with 13-inch wheel with, like a massively fat tire. And it's great because it's speed and all of, the experience is great, but like, it's not something that the average consumer can say, oh, that's kind of cool because it's connected here, right? And maybe that's not important to Formula One, or to the average person, but to me, as somebody who's watched racing for a long time, that was something that I always kind of it was odd. So next year will be an interesting kind of redesign of the car, almost like resetting, this kind of approach for all of these teams, right? I forget some of the other regulations that are going to change, but maybe you could talk about some of that.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff.
So it's funny that you mentioned like the domination, because we've had that a lot in the past 20 years, right? It was Ferrari dominating. There was a odd McLaren championship in there, and then went to Red Bull with Seb for 4 years, and then we've had Lewis for the last 7. Or, well, we had Rosberg in there, but Mercedes has won the last 7. Anyway, But the biggest complaint now is that the cars can't follow each other close enough, right? You have to be within 1 second of each other to use the DRS, or drag reduction system, which is like a little flap that opens on the back of the car wing that gives you a little extra speed down the straights that lets you get close to the car in front. But as soon as you come to a turn, the dirty air from that the car's moving out of its way with its aerodynamics, the car behind is severely affected and loses a bunch of grip. So the regulations have been changed in a way. In addition to the tires, they're going away from the super complex outer aerodynamic pieces, the barge boards, all the little, if you look at a current F1 car close, there's all kinds of little bits and stuff sticking out everywhere that send the air in a million directions to keep the car planted. And they've gone to more of a ground effect car, first popularized in the 70s and 80s, that kind of sucks the air under the car, which thereby sucks the car into the ground, but doesn't cause as much of a wake in the air to the cars behind, so they can follow closer and hopefully provide closer racing. And there will still be top teams and bottom teams, but maybe they'll just all be a little bit closer together.
No, and I think that's all we want, so to speak, as neutral fans, is we just want a great deal of parity, because anybody should be able to set foot in a car and win on their day. And it doesn't seem like that happens that frequently in Formula One, but I do think we've seen instances, especially in this year, where we've had some pretty unlikely winners. And I think I read somewhere that almost half of the active grid has won a race, and that seems to be kind of a startling stat, because this sport seems to be very top-heavy in a lot of different ways. But that being said, I think we are about to wrap up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each one of my co-hosts, give me one other piece of pop culture that helped you appreciate Formula One. And I know Nick had mentioned that we'll do probably a movies episode later down the line, and we can go into those movies that made us kind of fall in love with the sport again. But give me something, whether it's a TV show like Talladega Nights, or sorry, a movie like Talladega Nights or Rush, or a book. What was something that allowed you to fall even more in love with the sport?
I mean, I think for me, probably just being, I would say Senna, the movie, being a fan, being that he was, connected to Honda and Acura and, so many different ways throughout my kind of growing up. He was just somebody that I always kind of paid attention to. I would say he was like the first kind of superstar in, that I actually knew of in Formula One, right? Like I learned other stories, but he was the one that I remember seeing in the newspaper, kind of things, and dating myself there. But watching that film gives you a kind of a glimpse into the challenges, the incredible, mental effort that goes into these races for these guys. The skill that you have to have, the kind of the arrogance that you have to have too. And also kind of keeps you grounded in reality, like he unfortunately passed away on the racetrack. And that's something that I think, there's not too many sports that you're risking your life every time you go out to participate. And so, it keeps all these, beyond superstars very human in a lot of ways by watching that film. And also just kind of introduces you into a lot of the backstories that can play out throughout the years, to the point of having these dynasties. Sometimes that dynasty is the same driver, creating dynasties for two different teams, like just because they don't want to drive with the other driver. So I would suggest Senna as like the starting point to kind of understand like why I love the sport, but I think there's a lot of other cool stuff out there too.
Yeah. So similar answer, different movie to Nick. The one thing that really, I guess made me appreciate the kind of insane nature of the danger of Formula One was a movie called Just One. Actually, it's just the number one. It's a documentary about the earlier years of Formula One, and they go pretty far back and show it in the 70s or 60s and 70s. It wasn't uncommon for a driver to die maybe every weekend or every other weekend, because they were building a car that is going, 180, 200 miles an hour as light as possible, which means there's not a lot of structure around them. Because, if you want speed, add lightness. And it's just and it was just kind of a socially acceptable thing to do. It's just like, oh, here's my rival that I'm racing against. Oh no, just kidding, he died. Like that doesn't really happen in any other sport. Like obviously there's grave injuries in all kinds of sports, but it's not just like par for the course to be like, oh well, we have 19 drivers for the next race. Oh no, somebody new joined the sport to fill that guy's spot. That doesn't happen anywhere else except for motorsport, and Formula One was, the pinnacle of motorsport. So
that reminds me of a very famous quote where somebody was talking about if you're a sportsman or an athlete, you die two deaths the day your career is over and then your actual death. Formula One is not that. Formula One, in that sense, they're pedestrian, because more often than not, if they have that big crash, that can be a very unfortunate thing. You were saying something, Nick, before I'll make my last pick and we'll close the show.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of reiterate what Todd was saying, because that was a great film. And I think, to going back to what I was, trying to express a little bit about my, more into sports car racing. Maybe we'll get into that in another episode. Formula One's an open wheel racing series, but the Le Mans series, having those ties into kind of the things that we see that end up trickling down into consumer goods, consumer cars, aftermarket parts, and those kind of things. I think, watching one will allow you to kind of understand and watching one and then seeing what Formula One is now allows you to kind of understand just how much safety, how much, improvements and progress is made in the design of everything automotive because of Formula One, right? Like, we have these cars that have these, kind of crazy halo systems that protect the drivers if the car rolls over. And those types of things aren't, going to be built into your car in the same visible aspect. But in a sense, that's what, the structure of your car is, right? It's designed to do that. So like, even though it's shrunken down into, a tiny single person cockpit, it's something that translates into, like an average consumer good, in my opinion. And I think, when you kind of look at the history and one does a good job of, kind of showcasing that, you get to see so much more and kind of, understanding the aerodynamics, like Todd made a great point that I think as this aerodynamic shift changes, right? Like the street cars that were like, I say this in a very loving, endearing way, but like the gaudy street cars of the 80s with the crazy body kits and the Gambala Porsches and all of those, like just over the top designs, those kind of are, in a sense, like a trickle down of what Formula One, aerodynamics, teach automotive designers, right? So those are the kind of things that I think as you kind of consume these other, movies or YouTube videos or whatever, things that you kind of see that also wrap you further into kind of the admiration for what goes on for all the people that you never actually get to meet on the screen, right? The guys that are building these cars that are putting in the thankless hours that don't get to stand, and be kind of regarded as this hero driver.
No, I think that is expertly said. And for me, as somebody that fell in love with the personality of the drivers as much as the technical, I'll make a suggestion that's more a fictionalized recounting of a very interesting time in Formula One, and that's in the movie Rush, which chronicles the rivalry, if we want to call it that, between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. And it's set in the 70s, and it's the best and the worst aspect of race car driving in terms of the mentality and that ego, because you do see the pomp and glamour and the glitz and everything that you think is what a race car driver is. That movie will make you believe it and lure you in with probably a cheap stereotype, but it's so expertly done. And just some of the race footage that they've got from the archives and then they've also recreated is just fun. And after watching those two movies, you will probably feel a little bit sad based on the fact that this is a sport that's unfortunately characterized by a lot of danger. So this is a proverbial dessert at the end of that viewing party, if you will. So that being said, we will kind of go for the checkered flag, if you will. Sorry, I had to search for a pun there. But where can they find you guys? Todd, where are you on the social media?
On Instagram at Teezy, Teeyeezy.
Excellent. And Nick, how about yourself?
At Nick Engvall on all the platforms, and ICKENGVALL.
Perfect. I'm at RoAtM13 on Instagram, on Twitter at Roheezy. Thank you for listening, and yeah, look forward to the next one.
Thanks, y'all.
Peace.
Peace.
Go watch Drive to Survive.
Yes, please do.
Hey everyone, this is Nick again. Before you take off, do us a solid and head over to Apple Podcasts to leave us a review. Give us a rating on Spotify and Amazon Music, and make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel because we have even more video content coming soon. Speaking of new content, we have an amazing community of sneaker enthusiasts that hang out in our Sneaker History Discord on a daily basis. While sneakers is a connection point that brought us all together, we've all discovered countless shared passions that we have in common with each other. We recently launched a couple of new podcasts directly from our community. One of them is a Formula One podcast. If you're an F1 fan like me, the Exhaust Notes podcast is your weekly fix of Formula One fun. It's hosted by myself, Rohit Malhotra, and Todd Yates. New episodes drop every Tuesday. I've been wearing fitted hats for years and collecting my favorite teams since I was a little leaguer. It has been awesome to see so many new fans getting into fitteds in recent years. Crown and Stitch is our new talk show about fitted hats with Dexter, Keith, and myself, where we talk about fitted hats, snapbacks, throw in some obscure hats because we all kind of like some funky stuff once in a while, don't we? Copping, collecting, and so much more. New episodes drop every Wednesday. Hit the links in the show notes for this episode to give our new shows a listen, and be on the lookout for more new podcasts dropping soon. Last but not least, tell someone you like their kicks today. You never know how far a simple compliment can take you, and we all know how good it feels to have someone show their appreciation. Thank you all for the support, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Peace.